Jim
Demesis.
on the TIF incrementing. Tax increment financing presentation.
Good.
We'll leave it to you, Jim.
Great, thank you. I'll try to speak into the mic for people. So I'm here to give an overview of tax increment financing, and just to make clear, it's about tax increment financing in general. It might be stuff that some of you already know, who've been on the council and have dealt with TIFs before. For others, some of this may be new. And then I'm going to walk through it and basically open it up for questions that you have. It's not about a particular development proposal. It's about TIFs in general with some data around how they've been used in Saco and what that means fiscally. So I'm Jim Demesis. I'm with Camoin Associates. I'm the Senior Vice President. We're an economic development firm based out of Saratoga Springs, New York. I personally am out of Scarborough, Maine, and I work pretty much all over, a lot up and down the East Coast on economic development finance, market analysis, and that kind of work. So thanks for having me here. Let me just make sure I get this computer working good. Hold on one second. There we go. Page up and down. Yep. So what is a TIF? What is tax increment financing? This is, it can be pretty complex. Many states have them, and I'll just talk about it in general, and then I'll tell you more about how they work in Maine and in Saco. So it's a financing method. It's a tool used to catalyze economic development. And basically, it allows future property tax revenues from development to be dedicated and used to support the particular project and related economic development. So it's looking forward at how much taxes would be generated, how much value would be generated, and then it's tapping into portions of that future value to help support the project. The benefits, these kinds of benefits from the project are used to help finance infrastructure enhancements related to and required for the project. They can be used to help offset development costs overall and any other kinds of related development costs or project costs. And this is very important. They can be used for both to support both public costs as well as private costs associated with development and economic development. So the state of Maine enables municipalities to utilize TIFs. It's one of the few tools municipalities have to be able to support economic and community development. And if you go to the state law, it basically says they allow TIFs because they're trying to achieve several goals. New employment opportunities, improve and broaden the tax base, and improve the general economy of the state. To reach these goals, the state legislation enables municipalities to use TIFs for improving districts within their boundaries for the following kinds of development. Basically, it's allowable for industrial and commercial development, transit-oriented development, sometimes called TODs. The law specifically calls out arts-related development, particularly with regard to downtowns. And then it does allow for use of, to support residential development in support of commercial development, or for affordable housing. And then specifically it's allowed for, in the cases, to support downtown development. So what makes TIFs work and why they're an important tool for municipalities is you have to understand the property tax in Maine and how we fund schools, the counties, and how we apportion what's called state municipal revenue sharing. So property value, the higher your value as a community, your overall property evaluation, that impacts those funding formulas. It impacts the amount that you receive in state aid for education, municipal revenue sharing, and what you pay in county taxes. And I'm not going to suggest that this is the way, just because this is the way it is, it's therefore correct. I'm just going to tell you how the law and how the process works. So the formula's property values are based on the fact that the higher a community's property is, the higher its valuation is, the wealthier that community is. And therefore, the less it should receive from the state relative to other communities, and the more it should pay to the county. And that's the basic premise of how we fund essentially the state and local government fiscal system in Maine. So an increase in property value, if you have an increase in property value, you're going to get less state aid to education, you're going to get less municipal revenue sharing. And most of you know what municipal revenue sharing is, but it's the formula that the state utilizes to share income and sales tax revenues with the municipalities, because municipalities have no authority to raise income or sales taxes. And then finally, the amount that you pay to your county taxes as a community is directly related to the portion that you have in property tax value. So this one is just a little bit more deeper on that. It basically says that the state aid to education, it's based on the essential, what's called the essential programs and services funding. They apply a mill rate to that, and that mill rate is applied to your valuation. The higher your valuation, the more that you need to raise locally. The lower your valuation, the more that the state kicks in for its portion. Revenue sharing, it's ultimately based on population, the tax assessment or taxes rate and valuation, and valuation has a negative effect on it. In other words, the more that you have in valuation, the less you get. And finally, the county taxes, they simply divide up the total amount to be raised at the county level for the county taxes, and the percentage that each municipality pays is directly related to their property valuation. So, what does that mean? So every time you have a development and you add to your property tax base, if you will, you are bringing in revenues locally, but you're also offsetting some of those revenues based on those fiscal formula impacts. So in a sense, there's a disincentive to support economic development at the local level. So in order to reach those statewide goals of growing your tax base, diversifying your tax base, the state allows you to say, well, if you're going to do this development and you're going to put it in a TIF, we're going to allow that valuation to be what's called shelter. Or as Bill had mentioned before, which is a good way of putting it, if you've ever seen the Harry Potter movies, it's a cloaking device. It makes that valuation invisible, essentially, for the state valuation purposes, for those fiscal formulas. So you can do that up to 30 years. So you're allowed to be able to raise the property tax revenues locally from that development, but when the state looks at your overall valuation for those fiscal formulas, it acts as if it doesn't even see it for up to 30 years. This allows municipalities to avoid the losses due to the state and county fiscal formulas. However, there's a trade-off. So the question becomes, why wouldn't I just do this for all of my property, all of my potential new development in a city? And the answer is that two reasons. One, there's caps on it. In other words, there's a certain amount of property acreage-wise that you can't go above in terms of the total amount of acreage that's allowable to be put in a TIF. And you cannot put there's a cap on the amount of valuation that you can put into a TIF as well. That prevents a municipality from TIFing everything, essentially. The second big reason why you wouldn't TIF everything is because the revenues from a TIF can only be utilized for specific economic development purposes. So, for instance, you cannot use them for general fund or what you decide to do annually to support your police, your public works, your general operations of government. Now, essentially, it's fairly broad in what you can call economic development, as long as it's directly supporting a project, the district itself, or related to improving the economy overall. There's ways to justify that through the TIF. But again, you can't just put it into the general fund. You've got to take that money and put it specifically into what's called a TIF development fund, and then you can only use it for those specified purposes. And I can talk more later about what some of those specified purposes are, but there's quite a few of them, actually. So this is just, this doesn't work too well if you're not really up close. Some people are visual. Basically it's just showing that what you don't go into, what doesn't go into a TIF, you end up having those formula impacts, and that takes away from your fiscal bottom line. If you put it into a TIF, you're able to avoid those fiscal impacts, but you have to use the money only for specified development purposes. Yeah, these are, the entire slideshow is going to be available, or is available on the web as well for those. It's somewhat dense. So it's meant to, I wanted you to have all the different notes associated with it. But in terms of the TIF process, so even though it's a state-enabled program enabled by state legislation, it's really in the hands of the municipality. And this is really important because it's not a developer's program. This isn't something that a developer, a business owner can apply for directly with the state and get a tax credit or something like that. They literally have to, it has to be a municipal application that's submitted to the state and approved by the Commissioner of Economic Development for the state. Now, in doing so, you can partner with a developer or a business owner to utilize this tool. Municipality is totally determines the percent of new valuation that it wants to put in a TIF. So if you're going to have a new development and it's going to be potentially, let's just say $10 million for sake of argument, you can decide what percentage of that valuation you want to apply to a TIF district. It could be anywhere between 0, meaning no TIF, or 100% for up to 30 years. And those sheltered revenues can be used to support municipal expenditures made necessary by the economic development, and they also can be used to incentivize a private investment by a business or a developer. And that percentage is also up to the municipality when it passes the TIF. There's no one number that you have to use. You can choose, for instance, to give back to a developer a certain percentage of their taxes to be paid, anywhere between 0 and 100% of their taxes to be returned to help support the economic development for up to 30 years. So those are totally up to the municipality to decide at the time of the TIF. So the TIF bottom line, what does all of this mean? TIFs can be used, the TIF can be both, it can support both economic development and be a fiscal benefit if it's done in a fiscally responsible way and integrated with your planning. If the municipality wishes to support economic development as a matter of policy, in other words, if you're trying to do certain things with economic development, develop your downtown, your industrial parks, your transportation, those kinds of things to support economic development, TIF offers an opportunity to significantly reduce the revenue losses due to state and county fiscal formulas. The revenues must be used for the specified purposes. You can share those between the municipality and the developer, and they can be structured in a way that even with the incentive, in other words, you can structure them in a way that even if you're going to support a private developer and help offset some of those development costs for that private developer, because of those formula impacts, you can do it in such a way that you as a municipality are better off than you would be if that development did not occur. And that's an important point, that last point about if the development did not occur. Because when you submit to the Department of Economic Development, you must make the case that this development would not occur but for, and that's the key term, but for this type of incentive. So it's not meant to incentivize things that would otherwise occur in the market. It's meant to fill a gap, things that the private sector is able to handle for the most part, but for X dollars, this project would happen, and therefore you would put money on the table or support it in a public-private partnership to make that happen. And it's usually, and most often, not the only money that's available to a private developer besides their own personal money. They're going on, they're using equity, they're going into debt, they're sometimes using historic tax credits, they're using other programs and services, and this is meant to help finance the gap. So I'm going to just walk through a couple of detailed examples of what this means for Saco, and then I'll open it up to questions. So let me give you an example in Saco, and this is, I use this based on your Saco Island Building 4 TIF at the time of approval. So these numbers were calculated at that time, and they're based on your FY 15-16 tax rate of 18.62 mils. So in that particular case, what does this mean in terms of those fiscal formulas? So if you had an increase, at that time it was estimated the increase was going to be $11.7 million in valuation. Quite a substantial increase to valuation. Well, if you added that and you didn't TIF it, you would be taking those property taxes in, but you would be losing annually $95,000 lost to state aid to education, $8,000 lost to municipal revenue sharing, and $6,000 increase in county tax. That results in a $109,000 negative fiscal impact from the fact that you've increased your valuation. So if you look at that development, not all is lost. You actually do raise some money. You actually take that 11.7 million, and that 18.62 mils generates just over $218,000 in general revenue funds. So when you figure that out, the $218,000 you take in, the $109,000 loss because of the formulas, you're actually only keeping 50 cents on the dollar. And that's not unique to Saco. This type of formula applies across the board. Essentially, I call it, as a consultant and as someone who's worked in economic development for 30 years, it's really the dirty secret of economic and community development in Maine. Our state fiscal policy and the way that we finance local governments heavily penalizes communities for doing economic development. And TIF is a way to offset that and say, you're putting your money on the table, you're putting your sort of skin in the game as a municipality. This allows you to keep some of that 50 cents on the dollar and be able to use it for economic development. So here's an example I looked at with the support of Bill and the Economic Development Department. I took what you have for 2017 on the books. You have 8 active TIFs. With roughly, these are rounded, $46 million in sheltered valuation. So I point these out because, and there's the individual TIFs. I point this out because one is, as most of you know, you're actively using TIFs. Some of these have been on the books for a while and are set to expire very soon, 2017, 2018, and 19. Some are more recent, and they're going to be active for up to 30 more years or so. And you can see there the dates that they're set to expire. The key point, though, is that you are now utilizing and making use of these TIFs, but as they expire, you'll have additional capacity to be able to utilize TIFs and keep more than 50 cents on the dollar, should you, as a matter of policy, choose to support economic development.
On that, if I may, Jim, on this particular slide, there's we had a downtown TIF called the Saco Island or Downtown TIF, originally done in 1986, which reached its maximum legal 30-year limitation. That brought about 26 million in sheltered value, is back in the general fund, no longer sheltered from the state. We also, if you look, you'll see Saco Island Mill Building number 4 is only 3,350,000. And the example Jim showed was going to be 11.8 million. The reality is it's probably going to be significantly higher than that 11. However, the assessor is only going to assess it based on the progress of the construction. And Maine Molecular was looked at, again, as of April 1. They moved in on April 8th, moved a lot of equipment in. So those will see a significant uptick in the sheltered value over the next year. Just thought I'd point that out.
So what does this mean fiscally? So I took these as a whole, rather than, I gave you an example before of one TIF, but when you add them all together, what does it mean in terms of 2017? So you have 8 active TIFs in Saco, $46 million in property value sheltered. They generate approximately $192,000 in revenues. I'm sorry, 892. It's getting late. They generated $892,000 in revenues. This is annual numbers now, based on FY17. So that money, depending on the TIF, you have various arrangements where some of those accrue to the city for their uses for economic development, and some of those support TIF obligations to developers. So in terms of, there's $569,000 that are raised for city economic development purposes, and there's another $323 that are to obligations to developers under the TIF agreements. If the valuation was not sheltered, if it was just simply allowed to happen, now again, it likely would not have occurred if it did not have a TIF, and it certainly wouldn't have occurred to the degree that it did. So that's a big if. But if you did not shelter it and utilize a TIF, you would lose 50% of those revenues, or $446,000 of that amount. So in other words, without a TIF, you're only essentially retaining $446,000. So therefore, the TIF provides a net fiscal benefit to the city of $123,000. You're $123,000 to the good, and you can support private development through those public-private partnerships that otherwise would not occur. Now, that's, again, I want to point out that that means that money cannot be used for general fund purposes. So you don't want all of your money in the city going purely to economic development. But to the extent that you're going to be spending on economic development and related infrastructure and programs, this is a very powerful tool. So overall, the findings in Saco, TIFs have helped the city grow and diversify its economic and tax base, employment, jobs. It's helped diversify it. Several TIFs will be expiring, as you saw from those dates, and therefore additional opportunities for fiscal and economic, what I call win-wins exist, and this is key, with proper planning and policies. So TIF is like any other tool. People say to me, well, explain TIF. Isn't a TIF just simply a giveaway? Well, think of a TIF like a hammer. A hammer is neither good nor bad. It is what it is. It's one tool. It all depends on who's swinging it, the purpose they're swinging it for, and sort of why they're trying to swing it, and what guidelines and type of planning they use to do it. So it's exactly like any other tool in that sense. So how can you get more of these win-wins? And this is critical. One is integrate it with your core objectives. In other words, don't be willy-nilly with your TIFs. Think about what you're trying to achieve with your own planning and economic development, whether it's your strategic plan for economic development, or are you trying to grow the tax base? Are you looking to grow your workforce? Are you trying to diversify your economy? I call placemaking in there, because downtown TIFs are often about what we call placemaking, creating special places and environments, community and downtown development. Understand the net fiscal impacts, and that is a different number for every community. And it's also different for every type of development. Each type of development that you have has certain impacts, not just on TIF, but in terms of what it does to your overall budget in terms of expenditures and the kinds of demands that it puts on your services, but also in the kinds of revenues that you put on. So you constantly have to understand what those net fiscal impacts are. I look to going beyond utilizing TIFs just to incentivize or have obligations to a developer, and start using them for your public infrastructure. At the end of the day, if you do certain things where you're improving your streetscapes, improving your roadways, improving your downtowns, and you're doing some brick and mortar stuff, you're going to be left with something that has a positive public benefit, regardless of what happens to that development in the future. So it's important to utilize TIF for both helping businesses, but also for thinking about what you need to do to support the community. This one is kind of obvious, but I will tell you it's often overlooked. Track and report progress. This is a separate accounting system, if you will, or tracking system, knowing how much you have in TIFs, where the money's going, what the results are, what the businesses are doing with the money, all becomes important. In fact, when a business enters into a TIF with you, and that kind of partnership, they are coming to the table for a public-private partnership and should be willing to agree to share a certain portion of their finances. Things like their pro forma, maybe not their proprietary market studies and things like that, but they should be willing to put on the table what kind of development are they occurring, how long will it take to get that development, what's the dollars behind it, what are their specific costs associated with that. So you want to track and report progress and then guide all of this with planning and policies, whether it's an overall TIF policy, but integrate it with your comprehensive plan and integrate it with your economic development strategy. The final slide, and then I'll take some questions and I can go into more detail if you want, but I also know that you have limited time. There are different types of economic development, and the PowerPoint that you've been provided has detail on each of them. It would just take another hour to go through all of them, which is time you don't have. But you can utilize TIF. There's an economic development TIF that goes through the Department of Economic Development. That's the common one. In fact, that's the one that you mostly have here of those 8, if not all of them. Then there is what's called a downtown TIF. It does some of the same things, but what I want to point out that's very important about a downtown TIF, Maine statute, and therefore the legislature, has determined that downtowns are worth supporting above and beyond regular economic development. So they allow you to do downtown TIFs, and anything that you put in a downtown TIF does not apply towards your caps. If you recall earlier, I said you can only put a certain percentage of your acreage and a certain percentage of your valuation into TIFs. Downtown TIFs are exempt from that, so they don't apply to those caps. Therefore, you can utilize downtown TIFs in a much more flexible way. There's also more allowances in terms of what you can actually use those monies on, including you can use it for municipal facilities within the district related to the downtown, for example. Transportation-oriented development, they're really designed to, and you guys, a lot of times this does not apply in Maine, but you are a great case where it does apply because you have transit-oriented development right here in the downtown that's occurring because of Amtrak and because of other kinds of, whether it's your busing or your Amtrak or pedestrian ways. But it's also designed to allow you to utilize TIF for much larger projects than you otherwise would. Transportation-oriented development projects usually involve significant infrastructure, and this is a way to do it. And then finally, there's TIFs for affordable housing. And I really want to point this out. You can do housing, residential housing, within a typical economic development TIF if it's for rental properties. In other words, the state says if you're doing a rental property, someone is paying a rent to a landlord is the threshold that they use, then that's considered a business and therefore it's considered economic development. So you can do what's called a traditional economic development TIF. You can also choose to do what's called an affordable housing TIF. That's an entirely different program, and it's overseen by the Maine State Housing Authority. And to do that, that's for housing that would be workforce housing, or it has affordable restrictions on it that you have to ensure a certain percentage of housing is kept affordable for the life of the TIF. A lot more details on each of those, but I wanted to give you that overview, and let me stop there.
All right, we open it up to questions. Anybody in the council got questions?
Wait, huh?
I know it was quite a bit, so.
How about anybody in the public?
I'll go two.
Huh?
I'll have 2 questions.
Okay, go ahead, Kevin.
You brought up the Mill 4 example, so I'll use that as the example for my question.
Yeah.
As everyone, well, maybe most people don't know that we approved a TIF last year on Mill 4, which is 150 apartments. So those are here for either the Notre Dame or the lease of the down there. That's, as you know, a lot more people coming in, so we'd like to see how that goes. And that also combined with commercial on the first floor as well. What's not in your numbers, I don't know how not all TIFs are created equal. I think
Exactly, that was one of my points.
And maybe one of the original spirits was to create economic development in, say, industrial parks that don't have demand on city services. What's not in your numbers is, there are city service costs to, say, the Mill 4. We have impact fees, we have fire and police services. How do you present that in this presentation as a potential drawback of costs to the city?
Yeah, so I actually did present that. In other words, I totally your question is a very good one, and your point is actually very accurate.
Not in the Mill 4 example of
Well,
50%.
yeah, well,
no.
let me just address the question, please. So what I mean by that is, remember I said it's one tool, and I'm only on that slide looking at the fiscal formulas. But when I went on to talk about how you need to incorporate the thought and use of TIF within full understanding of fiscal impacts, that's where I was referring to that. And let me expound on that. And that's what I meant by every single project, that net fiscal impact is unique to the community, and it's unique to the kind of development that occurs. So in other words, in order to utilize TIF effectively, you have to understand those fiscal formulas, which we presented tonight, and those were, I know they can get complex, but that was pretty simple. However, to fully answer your question, you are absolutely correct that what you then need to look at that in relation to both the expenditures and the revenues that are generated by that development outside of the TIF. So if you're going to have a development that's going to, let's just say, you have to then start looking at what are going to be the generated expenditures. What's it going to do to my police, my fire, my traffic, my public safety, my traffic pickup, those kinds of things. Those things that are going to create demands for your services and therefore expenditures. The same thing, you also, to be fair, there's always, we're talking public accounting here. You got to look at both sides of the ledger. So you also have to look at the excise taxes generated, the other kinds of economic development that spins off of it and also creates additional revenues and expenditures. Now that sounds complex, but there's fairly easy formulas to be able to figure out what those net fiscal impacts are. So when I suggest, let me just give it as a hypothetical, that let's just say you do the numbers and you're going to be $200,000 a year to the good by utilizing the TIF just on those fiscal formulas, that's only part of the problem or part of the question. You then have to say, how is that further going to be impacted by both revenues and expenditures associated with that development? So you're right, this presentation didn't get into the methodologies to do that, but you absolutely need to think about TIFs in relation to those other fiscal impacts.
Well, excise taxes are cars, right?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Excise taxes are cars, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just
Yeah.
I want to make sure. The second question is more of the macro, what's happened in the state. TIF shelter income and affects the state formula back and forth. The ED 279 doesn't come out during budget season. It's on the school side, so really it isn't a dollar for dollar correlation in our budgeting process of what's going on with sheltered income. I mean, it's just the reality.
Yeah, so what I've done, so your point is really well taken, and I recognize it. And so let me answer the question, if I may.
Let's go into more of a final question on that.
Well, I just wanted to be clear that, because you made the point, but before you go with the question, that assumption's partially correct, and I just want to make sure we get it right, which is there is a lag in the amount of time when your increase in valuation therefore impacts your formulas. Therefore, it's not dollar to dollar per se as well. So when you have an increase of $10 million in valuation, the current fiscal year or even the next 2 fiscal years are not going to be fully impacted in your formula. But it also operates on the same way. So in other words, you're not going to start seeing those fiscal losses from valuation for 2 to 3 years, and then you're not going to start, let's say you have a 30-year TIF, you're not going to start seeing them therefore drop off the books for 2 or 3 years afterwards. So in a sense, it's a wash that way.
Well, it's like economics. You're assuming perfect information on economic science, which you don't have. I mean, council doesn't see clear numbers on that. It's separated by time. It's separated by schools and cities.
Yeah.
But my overall question was the state just approved the 3% surtax on 200,000 and up. It had a lot to do with the state not getting money back to, say, Saco on education. What's your feelings on that, how that dynamic? What's your just general feelings coming in from the
no,
outside?
great question, because it's like, it just happened, right? And kind of surprising that it did, actually. Haven't had a full time to think about it as an economist, but here's my thought on it. One is, I think this is just my thought now, not about Saco. I actually feel that there's gonna, regardless of whether you think it's good or bad, from an economic standpoint, I believe there's a lot of pent-up demand for increasing school expenditures. Statewide, I'm not talking about Saco now, I'm just talking about macro, because that was your question. So I actually think what's going to happen is, yeah, will it relate to property tax relief? I think it will to some extent, but I also think it'll also increase the amount of expenditures, public and local and statewide, that we're going to be putting into education. So with all that said, I actually think, therefore, it becomes as important to utilize TIF in the future as it has in the past. Because realize this, and this is, again, for some of you, I'm 51, some of you in the audience are younger, you may not remember this, but some are older than me. You remember when, if you've been in Maine a long time, we had a long time problem or dissatisfaction with movement towards what was called a uniform property tax. And that was where we said everyone's going to pay the same amount of mills for education regardless of where you're located. And this was 30 years ago or beyond. Well, at the end of the day, that's essentially what we have right now. We have essential programs and services. We created a 6-page formula called ED 279, which basically is a uniform property tax at the end of the day. Therefore, I go back to my original premise, which is you are penalized for growing your property tax base because of the way that the state funds education. So TIF is now and will be in the near future the only tool you have to offset that. Good questions.
Any other questions from the council? I'll put it out to the public. Anybody from the public like to ask any questions? Well, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.